Welcome, everyone. We'll get started in about a minute or two. Thank you so much for joining us today. If we could perhaps start the presentation. Thank you so much. We'll go ahead and begin first with a bit of housekeeping, no? And we sincerely welcome you to this plenary session, Accountable Advocacy, the presentation of a methodological framework for the assessment of gender justice policies, inclusive of work with men and boys. We're really excited to share this session with you today. And just to anchor, if you would like to share any of the insights that are emerging from this session today, which I guarantee you there will be many, please feel free to use the hashtag for the symposium to do so. Hashtag Ubuntu Symposium, or in Spanish, hashtag Simposio Ubuntu. And there you can anchor any of the insights that you hear that might be of interest that you would like to amplify. Wonderful. So I begin with the warmest welcome to our panelists today, both Niha Sud, principal at FemJust, and Linda Sela, as well, principal at FemJust. We really welcome you. They will be our main panelists today as we unfold in this presentation. And next slide. And I will be the facilitator for today. My name is Jennifer Rodriguez Bruno. I'm also the advocacy manager for MenEngage Alliance and will be facilitating the session. So it's a pleasure to be here with all of you. Thank you again for joining, and we'll, in a moment, meet our panelists a little more in depth. And please go ahead with the next slide. Wonderful. So, as we begin, perhaps just to contextualize, the session for today, we wanted to begin with a brief history of the road to the development of the methodological framework. And just as a quick recap of how we've arrived to this moment of sharing this tool for wide use within the Alliance, and to just share a little bit, of how we got here. And over the course of 2019 and 2020, MenEngage Alliance carried out a joint collaboration alongside our colleagues at FemJust towards the development of the methodological tool for the assessment of policies inclusive of work with men and boys. And the methodological framework specifically works to assess the degree to which policies, both inclusive and standalone, work with men and boys from the design, content development, implementation, and monitoring and evaluation, support a gender-transformative policy framework and process, which is accountable to women, girls, and LGBTQIA plus individuals, has meaningfully consulted feminist and LGBT organizations, and puts forward a feminist-informed analysis and strategy on men and masculinities within them. And the methodological framework was used over the course of a year and a half almost to assess 10 policies across 7 regions, resulting in a comprehensive analysis that anchored around case studies and scorecards. And the research resulted in a review of promising practices and challenges in policy design, development, implementation, and monitoring and evaluation around the world, with the goal to work towards evidence-based advocacy analysis for feminist-informed and rights-based policies and processes. So this session really seeks to unpack the high-level findings of the comprehensive analysis, as well as the methodological framework used as a tool that can be utilized widely by MenEngage members and partners to improve their policy advocacy from national to regional to global levels. Thank you so much. And next slide. And just a quick recap, and we will be sharing these resources at the end so you can link to them. But in terms of why did we decide to engage in this collaboration, I thought it would be great to just pause and quickly run through a brief history, in terms of how we got to this moment. And really, it has begun before this, no? But in 2017, we were engaged in some advocacy around the Human Rights Council Resolution 3510, promising practices and the prevention and elimination of violence against women and girls, with a specific focus on engaging men and boys. And so this process really put forward a resolution fully dedicated to the engagement of men and boys and strategies towards the elimination and prevention of violence against women and girls. This was an important moment in the progress and nuance of the normative framework on this work. Next point. And this resolution mandated the production of a follow-up report by OHCHR looking into promising practices in the engagement of men and boys towards violence prevention and response. Here we had almost 20 members and partners who submitted inputs towards the production of that report, which really honed in and focused on the need for accountability in the work from programmatic to policy level. And so highlighted very specifically on the critical importance for all efforts across all fronts to be anchored deeply in an accountability framework, and actually highlighted some of the work that MenEngage Alliance does on accountability as a promising practice in this regard. Next point. Seeing a need to continue to raise capacities in nuanced conversation, this process that we followed from the Human Rights Council resolution advocacy to joint advocacy around OHCHR report led us to continue to carry out this journey with a briefing with the CEDA committee, in which we continued to raise some of these advocacy points across the framework of the need for policies and programs that work with men and boys to be gender transformative, feminist-informed, human rights-based, intersectional, and accountable. So we continued to carry out some advocacy with dedicated conversations with the CEDA committee. And if you can continue. Next point. Which then led to a much more dedicated space where we were able to continue to dialogue with the CEDA committee, obviously noting the critical importance of this body, in their role, their essential role at international level of reviewing national policies through national reviews within the CEDA committee. So continuing to have this conversation, this critical conversation with policymakers regarding how we can best support and monitor that policies that are either standalone or inclusive of work with men and boys are really being developed, carried out, implemented, and monitored in responsible and accountable ways. Hence, really the title of our session today, under accountable advocacy. Please, next point. And it's really important to take a moment to highlight that, because one thing that we were monitoring during this time was just this notable uptake in the number of stakeholders, including very specifically how many governments are incorporating work on men and masculinities within policies, but also programs and whatnot. This includes development agencies, UN agencies, but just over the course of this time of these various spaces and advocacy efforts that we're discussing above, we had at one point monitored almost 80 countries reporting through, for example, submissions to the OHCHR report. There were many governments that had also submitted some indication of efforts at national level of work with men and boys. And please, next point. And this really led us to understand on the critical need for evidence-based recommendations with nuanced depth of assessment across an intersectional feminist political analysis and accountable, inclusive feminist process. In some ways, the advocacy for work with men and boys needed a next step in its evolution of nuance. And hence, this consultancy and collaboration that we carried out together with colleagues at FemJust was particularly to be able to surface some of the richness, no, that we needed to continue to advance with clear evidence-based recommendations for policymakers, especially amidst this context of increasing uptake of work with men and boys from programmatic to policy level. Thank you so much. If we can go to the next slide. And so we'll just quickly take a moment to run through the high-level findings of the analysis of the 10 national policy scorecards and case studies that we carried out. And we just very quickly wanted to share that the designed final products are forthcoming, and to note that this work is so rich and that we will absolutely need to take much time over the next months and years, I would say, to continue to unpack the results of this case study, and that you will be contacting that soon, and that here we will be specifically focusing on the methodological framework as a tool that we can unpack today and understand how to adapt across many levels, from national to regional to global. And so here we just wanted to share high level what we found across those 10 case studies across 7 regions. Please, next slide. Wonderful. So point number 1 was that no policy review demonstrated practices that were consistently aligned with feminist and human rights-based approaches at every stage of the policy process. Instead, many governments embraced elements of each approach to varying degrees, and some more meaningfully than others. And nearly all governments committed to stakeholder engagement in at least one aspect of their policymaking, and in doing so, created opportunities for civil society participation. And success in facilitating participation across a diverse range of stakeholders varied greatly. In some of the most successful cases, pardon if you don't mind going back, one last point on this, no? Consultations were organized, which included rural women, Afro-descendant women, transgender women, lesbians, indigenous women, teenagers, young women, women with disabilities, with HIV, women sex workers. And according to stakeholders, this contributed directly to robust and intersectional policy proposals. In other cases, stakeholder participation was the result of advocacy or facilitated by external support, for example, only after facing sustained pressure by civil society, or technical or financial support by the UN system was helpful in ensuring that community-led consultations was held. And yet, just to note here how critical that participatory intersectional consultation really is to the policymaking process. Thank you. Next slide. The exclusion of LGBTQIA plus groups and organizations from policymaking processes was disturbingly common due to criminalization and other forms of discrimination, and subsequent concerns that the inclusion of issues affecting the rights of LGBTQIA plus people would prevent the adoption of policies was commonly cited. As well as the lack of understanding that non-binary and queer people are key stakeholders affected by gender inequality. And governments widely utilized a wide range of approaches and strategies to address gender inequality in their countries. Many strategies address power imbalances and challenge harmful norms and behaviors that fuel inequality, violence, and discrimination. Some strategies integrated male involvement through the provision of sexuality education, and the inclusion of sexuality education as a key policy strategy created important opportunities to disrupt harmful gender norms, or it additionally opened up space for work towards sexual rights and citizenship and co-responsibility. In some cases, both gender transformative and regressive tactics sit within the same policy. In one country, for example, policy includes a focus on attitudinal change, promoting positive gender relations, and engaging men in denouncing sexual and gender based violence. But in order to adopt the policy, a critical analysis of masculinities was excluded. And the policy stopped short of stating that laws criminalizing same gender sexual activity should be repealed and that marital rape should be criminalized. So just to note on the complexity of how this really plays out across contexts, no? In other countries, the strategy included and policies altogether failed to focus on empowering women or utilize strategies that diminish accountability to those most affected by gender inequality and violence. And limited financial resources and funding, opacity for policies on gender equality, GBV, and sexual and reproductive health was a significant barrier in many countries. In some contexts, only proposed and not actual budgets are routinely disclosed. In other cases, the lack of a specific budget for the implementation of the policies inhibits implementation efforts and undermines accountability. So other times, a lack of funding for the implementation and monitoring of policies is not simply owing to deficient resources, but also to lack of political will and prioritization for gender-related policies. Wonderful. And our last high-level point, no, is robust monitoring and evaluation of policies is critically important for measuring progress towards goals, adjusting interventions as needed, and ensuring accountability. However, many countries performed poorly in this respect. And we pause or end the recap there. But just to note, in some ways, that's what has been so incredible about this effort is not only to assess policies across the overall political framework of the alliance, but also to assess them from the entire policy process lens, no, from policy design, development, implementation, and monitoring and evaluation. So just to note on the richness of the results really arising from that lens. And so we just wanted to take a moment, no, to connect with all of you. That was quite a lot to unpack. And so just to take a moment to pause and to see what do you find surprising regarding the results that were just read out? And does any of this resonate, no, for you within your context and region? Yeah, please do share in the chat box. And if you would like to, I see Apta, you've raised your hand. Wonderful.
Um, First, I just want to thank you, Jenny, for this amazing overview and for all the work that you and MenEngage have been doing to put this all together. I think it's just an incredible resource for advocacy initiatives and to truly understand what's going on or the trends that are going on around male engagement. I think my question, I wanted to understand a little bit more about kind of the point you made about the gender transformative policies or that someone be made in and its attachment or lack thereof to like policies around male engagement and accountability. I'm wondering if you could tell a little bit more about kind of if you could see through either the processes or through stakeholder engagement where that disconnect is. From my, I mean, it's not surprising to me because mostly because from my sort of anecdotal understandings and conversations, I think the understanding of what gender transformative means is still like lacking in a lot of spaces. But I'm not sure if that's what you're seeing on the policy level when these decisions are made, or if it's something else that's more, I don't want to say sinister, but something more of like applying a name, but actually using it to just kind of as a superficial cover for what was going to pass anyway.
Thank you so much, Apta. And I'll leave space for our colleagues and panelists to share their thoughts as well. But I think it's quite wide ranging, as one of the slides mentioned, no, just And let me highlight again that the results of the 10 case studies and scorecards will be out soon. These are incredibly rich documents. I think something that surprised me the most from the work that Linda and Neha carried out was to contextualize how the policy is emergent from an already complex historical, social, and political context, right? And so to your point, no, how this intertwines, the emergence of the policy intertwines and emerges from these very complex dynamics, and how in some cases, right, yes, the policy is advancing a progressive framework perhaps on work with men and boys, but for example, is emerging within contexts in which women's rights, policies on women's rights have been severely marginalized or not funded. So it's very complicated. And I think in a way that's sort of the point of really deepening the framework of analysis, is to be able to have a richer dimension through which to assess what is taking place, rather than from a framework of yes, check, this country has, right, a policy inclusive of work with men and boys. That is no longer sufficient, right? Even to say the content advances a gender transformative lens. If this is taking place within a context where marginalized stakeholders are not included, the policy process is not feminist, right? Many of these points, then it's no longer an acceptable or accountable policy advocacy process. So I think that's sort of the point, no? And it varies widely in context, but just to be able to have a richer dimension for analysis of what is taking place, and to be able to assess from that perspective, no? If the policy effort was accountable and is supporting progress rather than harm towards the realization of women's rights and LGBTQIA plus rights. No, I'm seeing John. I often see governments, funders, or UN organizations and NGOs following a particular trend, focusing on men and boys without the accompanying analysis of the patriarchal realities for everyone, hence suddenly calling for exclusive attention and providing funding to work with men and boys. Absolutely. And that's what we wanted to assess, right? From the perspective of accountable advocacy, it is not our perspective to, as we were mentioning, seeing the monitoring of how many governments are implementing policies, to think, oh, 80 policies across the world, to some extent, including work with men and boys, but to really critically assess, are those being done, right, through feminist-informed, intersectional, accountable framework, to really go in deeper to understand the complexities that are taking place. No, wonderful. Let me just see if there's any other comments. It's interesting to see how common it is for governments and their policy makers to exclude vulnerable groups and not have their approach be gender transformative. Yes, absolutely. I think that's one of the main sort of highlights of the analysis, no, how common that was. Also, the funding and monitoring and implementation too, I think in a sense, that was another dimension of the analysis that we had not necessarily had any evidence on. So the results of that, and how common it is for there to be no proper follow-up of monitoring and evaluation, and how critical that is in the policy process to be able to fine-tune, no, and adjust policies so that they are meeting the needs of target populations. No, wonderful. Any other comments?
Jenny, may I chime in on adding a couple of points?
Please.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think I'm deeply appreciative of Apta's question and many of the comments and questions shared in the chat box. Just reflecting on what was said about like the disconnect between the gender transformative approach and programming possibly, of civil society and various movements, and then what we see sort of in policy processes, in policy documents, etc. I think one of the things that is very clear through this research is also just a lack of understanding of a gender transformative approach, a feminist analysis, also of gender inequality and gender-based violence, etc. So that like we're still seeing to this day this sort of understanding of, okay, gender equals women, and not sort of like a structural analysis of like power imbalances and patriarchal oppression. So what we see in policy and programs is often a focus on it's like interventions that are sort of like more service focused, right? Like we saw this with sort of the work around economic empowerment of women. So without sort of like addressing the root causes of the inequality, undertaking strategies and programs that are sort of like a band-aid on a big gaping wound, where we're not addressing the sort of, what causes the wound. I think another thing I wanted to mention was, to undertake a sort of like a feminist, human rights-based approach to policy making, it requires a very deliberate process. It requires a lot more sort of like time and resources than if governments or even other kind of entities, right, like large development institutions, etc., if they it's much easier, it's much faster if they just sort of take the decisions themselves and sort of form the policy, draft the policy themselves, or draft their programs and their strategies themselves, and have sort of like a perfunctory process for seeking input, but rather doing something collaboratively, but in a participatory manner. It requires a lot more time and resources. So what it really requires is a commitment to that approach, like really sort of deeply holding this view that approach, like the process is as important as the outcome. That is sort of really critical in order to sort of develop effective and meaningful policies and strategies and programs. And then I think just one quick comment on this subject of trends, right? Like the trend of like working with men and boys, and sort of what we see this trend sort of doing in the field. 100%. And this happens time and time again. We saw it with this trend around addressing child early and forced marriage. We saw it with the trend around economic empowerment of women, sort of like honing in on something like to the exclusion of like the larger context around it, right? And that is not a great approach, but we do see it sort of repeating and like happening over and over again. So it's something that we have to actively kind of like challenge and resist. Thank you, Jenny.
Thank you so much. And we have a few more minutes. I see some more comments, but Linda, do you want to come in? Any thoughts or anything you would like to add from the high level analysis, no? Of all the findings from the case studies and scorecards.
Hi, hi, Jenny. I'm not sure if you can see me.
Yeah.
Oh, there I am. Yeah. I don't have much to add, really. I think the both of you captured it very well. I certainly would pick up on the point that Yoni has made. That's something that stood out very starkly in our analysis, was that even when governments committed to good process at the sort of in the early phases of developing a policy, so in the policy design process, even if they were consultative or participatory in their manner of carrying out the development of a policy, frequently what was lacking was the actual implementation piece of it, the implementation and the monitoring and evaluation. And this is something that we saw almost completely across the board with all of the countries that we saw, is that if there were any strengths, they were definitely weighted towards the content of the policy and the process leading up to the content of the policy design phase. But that there were either insufficient budgets, insufficient personnel, which we'll get into, I think, a little bit later as an example. But it was lacking on the implementation and monitoring and evaluation end of it, which effectively, it can really debilitate a policy. It can really render it toothless if you've got a good policy on paper, but then nothing to sort of, you're not actually implementing it, or you haven't, allocated sufficient resources and or collaborated with key constituents in your country in the implementation, in the monitoring and evaluation. That's the only additional thing that I'd like to add, but yeah.
Absolutely critical point. Thank you so much. And let's see if there's any other comments. Jan shared, received a request for designing programs exclusively focusing on boys and men, forgetting that also men and boys don't live in isolation from their social context, and girls and women being groomed in the same patriarchal social norm formation. My insistence of addressing in such programs designs all diversities and not exclusively on men and boys has taken time to be accepted, as the agency wanted to score on focusing on men and boys. Yes. Really important point, no? And I think that's why we're here. How can we continue to support each other and make a contribution, no, to the wider discussion by being able to really critically assess our advocacy from just much wider and more nuanced dimension. And so here we perhaps move on to the next section. And again, noting, I'm seeing just a comment in the Slack regarding the 10 case studies. And again, these are forthcoming. They should be designed quite soon and we will share them. But again, just to center the conversation towards the next section, while 10 case studies were carried out across 7 regions to begin with, no, for this process. The reason we're having the conversation today too is, as we will enter into this next section, to unpack the methodological tool, because the point is really how can members and partners utilize that methodological tool to carry out their own assessment of policies within their own context. And then something really important about the design process, no, for this methodological framework was, and can it be applied to other levels? So national, regional, and global. So again, we will share the designed results of that process forthcoming very soon. But now we pass it over to Linda and Neha. Next slide, please. To begin this process of introducing and unpacking the tool itself, and please keep in mind from the perspective of how might you be able to utilize that within your own policy advocacy efforts. So I stop there and pass it over to the both of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Jenny. So what is the methodological framework for analysis of gender justice policies involving work with men and boys? It is a tool that can assist in analyzing a national policy that includes a strategic focus on working with men and boys, as well as assessing its impact. So it poses a set of questions for those analyzing a policy process to seek answers to, and together, all of these answers paint a picture of how accountable the policy process is to those people who are most affected by harmful gender norms and stereotypes and patriarchal masculinities. We're talking here about women, girls, queer, and gender non-conforming people, and also to their movements. It paints a picture of how intersectional the policy is and how gender transformative it aims to be. This framework is designed to be a flexible tool. Like Jenny mentioned, it can be adapted to analyze subnational policies, so for example, at the district or provincial level, as well as regional and global ones. Also, it can be applied to an entire policy cycle, like we'll discuss in the next few minutes, or to a part thereof. It really depends on sorry, can we go back a slide, please? It really depends on sort of what your purpose is with the analysis and how you intend to use it, what specific advocacy you would like to do at what point in the policy process. So this is quite a flexible tool, and you can sort of pick and choose from it, really to suit and adapt to your purposes. So let's unpack this tool. Next slide, please. Thank you. So 3 analytical frameworks were utilized in developing the methodological framework. These include intersectional feminist analysis, the human rights-based approach, and the socio-ecological model. Let's look at each of these in a little detail. Intersectional feminist analysis, what is it? It interrogates unequal power relations. It identifies the root causes of gender-based discrimination, violence, and inequality, and the oppressive systems and structures that uphold them. Intersectional feminist analysis recognizes that people carry various identities in addition to their gender, and it draws attention to the multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination and oppression that come to bear on their lives and their bodies in connection with their marginalized identities. This analysis advocates for transforming these structures and norms at the core, rather than just changing outcomes. And this analysis gives rise to the gender-transformative approach, which many of you are familiar with. This approach aims to rectify discriminatory and unequal power relations, to dismantle harmful gender norms and stereotypes, to transform patriarchal masculinities, and to promote gender relations that are based on equality and respect for human rights. Intersectional feminist analysis recognizes that women may also act to uphold the patriarchy because that is the system within which they have been socialized and raised, like Jan was saying, and that men may also act to dismantle it. It suggests that the holders of male privilege have the responsibility to recognize such privilege and to actively work to dismantle the patriarchal order, but under feminist leadership. The human rights-based approach is one that identifies rights holders and their entitlements, and corresponding duty bearers and their obligations. This approach is grounded in the principles of equality, non-discrimination, empowerment, participation, accountability, transparency, and sustainability. It emphasizes the importance of a few things, including ensuring that efforts to engage men and boys are fully accountable to the causes of gender justice and queer liberation, that enabling the participation of those most affected by policies and programs in the design, implementation, and monitoring is key. The need to take into account multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination and oppression, and the importance of focusing on the most marginalized populations. So there is a lot of synchronicity, there's a lot of complementarity between the intersectional feminist analysis as well as a human rights-based approach. Lastly, the socio-ecological model considers the complex interplay between the individual, the community or the society, institutions, and policy. It identifies these 4 realms as the minimum levels at which change needs to occur in order to achieve gender justice. Without sort of even one of these levels, our efforts are incomplete. So what this would translate to is that efforts to engage men and boys must seek to change their knowledge, attitudes, and behavior, to transform prevalent social norms and dismantle harmful gender stereotypes in society, including the construction of patriarchal masculinities. to also make social institutions adopt gender-transformative programs and policies, and at the policy level to bring about a legal and policy framework that is gender-transformative. Next slide, please. The three analytical frameworks are applied to these key aspects of a policy process. Could we please click to show all the points? Sorry, on the previous slide. Okay, I hope all the points are visible. So these three analytical frameworks that I just sort of described are applied to these 5 key aspects of a policy process, and it suggests a number of criteria for assessing each of them. So let's look at some examples together. With regards to policy design, the methodological framework suggests examining, for example, whether feminist, queer, masculinity, and youth activists and organizations were included in drafting the policy, or were they consulted, or were they excluded entirely? If they were consulted, was their input integrated or not? Who was included? Grassroots activists, community-based organizations, or only international NGOs? Was language interpretation and translation utilized to enable their access or not? Were they given enough notice to attend meetings or respond to drafts, or was the turnaround time unrealistic? With regards to policy content, the framework suggests examining, for example, whether the policy properly conceptualizes gender inequality by analyzing unequal power relations and gender and sexuality norms and stereotypes. Does it include strategies to transform prevalent power imbalances and social norms and to dismantle harmful gender stereotypes? Do the strategies take into account the intersection of gender discrimination and other forms of discrimination? Are the strategies based on the highest quality of evidence available? And so on. With regards to resource allocation, it suggests examining, for example, whether sufficient financial, technical, and human resources have been allocated for for implementation of the policy. If this is a standalone policy on working with men and boys, are other gender equality policies sufficiently resourced? Or does the policy divert funding from other critical policies? With regards to policy implementation, it suggests examining, for example, who is implementing the policy? Is it 1 or 2 departments of the state, or is it a multi-sectoral effort? Are the staff involved in implementation qualified, sensitized, and trained? Does the government collaborate with feminist, queer, masculinities, and youth groups and organizations to implement the policy? If it does this include grassroots groups and community-based organizations? Lastly, with regards to impact assessment, the methodological framework suggests examining change at the individual, institutional, policy, and society levels. It recognizes that such changes may be the result of the compounding of various efforts, hence utilizing the frame of contribution rather than attribution. Next slide, please. When applying the methodological framework to policy analysis, here are some things we suggest you consider. For data collection, include a wide and diverse range of stakeholders. For example, feminist, sorry, I just overheard someone else. Include a wide and diverse range of stakeholders. For example, feminist, queer, and youth activists, diverse groups of people such as sex workers, persons with disabilities, etc., organizations working on men and masculinities, government officials, academia, and UN agencies. Use multiple and accessible data collection tools so as to effectively include diverse participants and collect different kinds of data. For example, reviewing existing literature and reports, doing in-depth interviews and focus group discussions, and deploying written surveys. This will assist you in reaching a wider audience. Sorry, not audience, but like a wider range of participants to participate in the policy analysis. For data analysis, we suggest that you expect and reconcile differing perspectives. Engaging with a wide range of stakeholders provides a broad-ranging picture regarding a specific policy process. You may encounter instances where stakeholders have different recollections and assessments of key criteria. For example, the participation of activists and organizations in a particular process. In such instances, probe for details and seek out people with first-hand experience, including possibly your own, to get as full and accurate a picture as possible. With regards inclusivity, center and elevate the perspectives of those most marginalized and oppressed by the systems or institutions that we are seeking to change. Apply an intersectional perspective at every stage, taking into account the operation of multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination and violence faced by people due to their various identities. Lastly, high standards. It is important to set a high standard for analysis, even if you know beforehand that the policy process may be lacking in some regards. For example, the inclusion of LGBTQI issues and movements, or the quality of staff, or the allocation of budgets. We suggest that you don't discount these factors when doing your analysis, but really use the policy review and analysis process and exercise to build an understanding of why and how the state can and should do better in these regards. Very often when we're doing this kind of an assessment or a research, the main goal behind doing the assessment is not to to have an assessment. It's to use that to engage in dialogue with the institutions and authority figures to say, how can things be better? So even if you know beforehand that there are going to be limitations, right, to the policy process, don't skirt around it. Discuss it, probe it, go into it in detail, because that will sort of assist you in dialogue. Right? So we're going to open it up for discussion now. This sort of first question that we are posing to the group. We looked a few minutes ago at a few examples of criteria that can be used to analyze policy design, content and implementation, resource allocation, and impact. Applying the frameworks of intersectional feminist analysis, human rights-based approach, and the socio-ecological model, what other elements of the policy process would you like to assess? So can you share examples of sort of like, key elements, key criteria that you would like to assess if you were undertaking a review or an analysis of a particular policy in your country or in your region? So please give it some thought. Please share your thoughts either by raising your hand or using the chat box. And this really is your space. So you don't have to limit your interventions to this specific question. If you have thoughts or questions that you would like to raise at this point, please feel free. If you have questions about anything that was sort of shared in the past few minutes, that's welcome as well. Yeah, and I see your comment, intersectional positions within the broad category of youth. This easily goes wrong. If you'd like to elaborate a bit more, that would be quite welcome. Magali says, the extent to which civil society has been involved in design and implementation of policy. Yes, that's an excellent point. Really, we're sort of suggesting through the methodological framework that civil society be involved in each stage of the policy process: design, implementation, as well as monitoring and evaluation. Jan says, forming of a youth forum, but only urban elite youth, does not provide the correct picture. Absolutely agree. So, for instance, in a policy process, whether it's design or implementation or M&E, the different sort of like populations or like parts of civil society that we want states to be involving in those processes must be diverse, right? Like for young people, Jan says it shouldn't just be urban and say like elite in terms of class, socioeconomic factors, education, etc. We want to look at, like I mentioned, also the most marginalized youth, right? To make sure that their needs are being served through the policy. I hope I'm saying your name right. Noe says, which communities are directly and indirectly impacted by the policy? Absolutely, that's a really important element to be looking at. You know, what populations is the policy looking to work with? So in the strategies, for instance, you know, is it does it have diverse approaches to the groups, the populations that it seeks to engage and work with? Is it an evidence-based approach of sort of like, you know, which populations to prioritize sort of first? Is it also like a human rights-based approach of, you know, sort of prioritizing the most marginalized populations? So yes, that's a really important question that Noe raises. And apologize if I'm mispronouncing. Yoni says, hear from feminist and other relevant social justice actors about their assessment of the contents and implementation of the policy. Is it helpful to them? What should be done differently? Hearing from a multitude of voices enriches the picture we have. Absolutely agree. Say, just as an example, say a MenEngage Alliance partner in a particular country is undertaking a policy review or analysis exercise. It's really important to either collaborate with, if you know, resources of your partners allow, either collaborate with, or at least sort of be you know, involved and like listen intently to the perspectives of feminist activists and organizations, and also other relevant actors, like Yoni says. Uruj says the robustness and accurate alignment of the M&E portion and sufficient resource allocation for this part too. Absolutely agree. The M&E framework must be robust, it must be relevant and accurate, as you mentioned, and it must be resourced. It's all well and good to have like a robust M&E framework, but if there aren't human resources and financial resources allocated to doing M&E, then like Linda was saying earlier, that piece gets rendered toothless. Noe says, what budget? Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry. I just wanted to just sort of this observation that there seems to be, it's clear, this clear trend from what everybody is saying around the importance of participation from marginalized communities and from a diverse set of stakeholders, and not only just the participation, but the conditions of that participation be one that facilitates meaningful input, meaningful consultation with these groups. So I think that's just a point to draw, because that's the thread through all of these different, many of these comments that are coming up. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thanks, Linda.
Yeah, sure.
And yeah, stick around. So just continuing with the comments, yes, a lot of sort of complementarity between what different colleagues are saying. Because Noe says, what budget or financial structure is needed for implementation, sort of like echoing or like similar to a previous point. The comment about bringing on board victims and people who are at risk of GBV. Yes, absolutely. And Linda spoke to that a little bit, how the experience of marginalized groups informed the formation of the policy. Trisha says the extent to which the policy is part of a broader gender equality framework. Sometimes we create policies as standalone documents. For example, how is a country's gender policy connected to SRHR policies or even national development policies? I think Trisha raises a really important point here. And this speaks a little bit to what we were saying about also resourcing, right? So if you have the standalone policy, is this at the expense of other gender justice policies? If a country is a country jumping on a trend of developing a policy on working with men and boys, or does it already have a strong sort of policy framework addressing various other aspects of gender justice and gender equality? And this policy on working with men and boys is sort of adding to and complementing that framework. Excellent point. Suleiman says existing norms, culture, and religious views, and looking at areas where they intersect and can be mutually supportive. I think that's an important point. I think so this methodological framework, like we were saying earlier, is very flexible and it needs to be contextualized, right? Every sort of group or organization that may be applying it in their context needs to look at like what is the social context where they are, and sort of like look at how that affects gender inequality, and therefore the strategies that are needed to to address that context. Maybe those strategies for dismantling gender norms will be different in one context and another, based on sort of what the prevailing norms are. Bakia's point has been addressed. Jan, time required for participatory community-led baseline analyses. Yes, absolutely. I think that's a really important component of M&E. You have to have a baseline in order to do effective monitoring and evaluation. And I think Linda will back me up on this. We found this missing more often than not. So it is a really important point to be looking at and assessing. I think we have a couple more minutes for this question, and then we'll be moving on to a couple of other questions. As you mentioned previously, it is important. This is Valerie's point. It is important to have analytical tools to properly assess the implementation and impact of policies. At the moment, some great initiatives have been put in place, but few are well evaluated. Yes, and the population must be part of these policies. Absolutely, including the monitoring and evaluation of policies. Jan's point to what research is accepted as sort of valid or actual research. And the framework does address this point. There's a need to sort of take into account both sort of large, well accepted qualitative research, but also smaller scale quantitative research that may be done and may be very contextual, right? Like in different places, really tailored to the local context. Sometimes, like we're seeing, for example, in the field of prevention of violence against women, if the research sort of like can't be scaled, or the program can't be scaled, it's discounted and considered not valid. But that's not the right approach. So in designing policies and designing strategies, it's important to look at sound research, no matter sort of like the scale, the source. If it is sound research, if it's a strong evidence base, it must feed into the process. How is the policy linked to Tilina's point? Former policies on similar issues. Yes, we talked about this. Magali says, clearly defined terms throughout the process for consistent use and deliberate purpose of policy, for example, gender transformative, and checking definitions against various aspects of policy, expected outcomes, and the evaluation of unintended outcomes. I think if I understand your point, Margabi, you're talking about sort of you're talking about contextualizing, I think, and then sort of being consistent about what we mean by various things. Gender inequality, what causes gender inequality, what is gender transformative, what makes something gender transformative, and then being consistent with that. So totally agree. Thank you, everyone, for your robust participation and sharing really such relevant and important points. We will move on to the next couple of questions, and we have about 5 or 6 minutes for these next 2 questions. If Tamizan, if you could click once more to bring the third question as well. Thank you so much. So in addition to the key considerations that we mentioned, the diversity of stakeholders, accessibility of data collection tools, reconciling different perspectives, inclusivity, intersectionality, and high standards, what might be other key considerations that you may have to take into account when doing policy analysis in your country or in your part of the country or in your region? So what we're asking is, like, from your context, from your knowledge of your context, what might be other sort of like, things to bear in mind when doing policy analysis, when analyzing and assessing a certain policy? So please think about that. Please share that discussion. It might help a colleague in another country as they consider such a process. Also, if you could reflect on what challenges you might face in doing such policy analysis, I think that would be helpful for us to hear. Maybe, it creates space for us to brainstorm together. So yeah, we invite you to reflect on these the second and third question and share your thoughts. Thank you, Jenny. Yes, I'll say it out loud. Please feel free to write in the chat box or raise your hand to speak, whichever you find more comfortable. So Trisha says that a challenge may be the lack of political will to champion policies like these. Trisha, could you maybe say, is that the political will of, like, say, the government, the state, or also movements, or both? And do you think that the approach of the state would be a hindrance to doing such policy analysis or assessing, a policy process? It's just a question to consider. Our colleague says the feminism agenda in the country is very important. Yes, agreed. I think we spoke about this a little bit earlier, that, working closely with following sort of like the leadership of feminist movements is important as you proceed to do such work. Other considerations could be the political motivations of the day. Ruth shares, in Canada, we had a 10-year conservative regime where the elected leaders told policymakers what to present as societal truths. We have still not recovered from some of the foundational damage. Yeah, that's a really important point that you share, Uruj. That's a very difficult context in which to be doing such analysis and engagement. Yoni shares the questions from policymakers on what gender transformative policy looks like in practice, the how-to of interventions that address power relations. And I think there are resources, and of course there needs to be sort of more work, but there are resources that we can use in dialogue with policymakers that point to what gender transformative programming would look like. So yes, so our toolkit needs to have a few different tools as we do advocacy, both research and advocacy. Jan says, and then this is, sorry, the last comment we'll be taking, just with an eye on time, but there will be space at the end for more discussion and questions. So Jan says, reasons for self-imposed language restrictions to prevent opposition in the preparatory process. Is this valid or an excuse? Jan, do you mean like the preparatory process by the state to develop a policy? Could you give an example of a language restriction, just so we can reflect a little bit more on this point? And if you want to, because we are running out of time, if you want to use your microphone, please feel free to. Tilina says, if the terminology used is not agreed among the actors of the feminist movement and the state. So if you're referring to a process of policy analysis or assessment, women-headed households and women heads of households. Okay. So when you're doing, and please, Jenny and Linda, feel free to jump in. But sort of my sense is if you're undertaking together with with larger feminist movements an exercise of policy analysis or assessment, it's an independent process, and you set the terms and the terminology and your framework for analysis, etc. And you explain your framework, you explain your terms. And that's part of like what I was saying earlier, that the outcomes of your analysis or assessment are a tool for dialogue with the state. So if there isn't, and there isn't agreement between movements and states on so many things, right? But then the research that we do, the analysis that we do, the advocacy materials that we develop as a result of that, we use that to engage in dialogue with the state, to build understanding on that terminology or those frameworks for analysis. There's very few states that actually utilize an intersectional feminist approach in policy making. But through our work, through our analysis, through our advocacy, we seek to build understanding on it, and we see examples of sort of like educating, sensitizing, a few government officials at a time, and building up that cadre so that it translates into policy processes and implementation. So I hope that you enjoyed this discussion. We will, like I said, have more time for discussion at the end. But for now, I'm going to hand over to Linda to take us through a few more examples of like how to use and apply the methodological framework.
Okay. Thank you, Neha, and greetings, everyone. It's very late in the game for me to be saying this, but thank you for having us. We're thrilled to have been able to be a part of this process, and are happy that it can be used in country to support the work that you are all doing. So this section is focused much more on sort of the nuts and bolts of the methodological framework and how it can be used. And so, as we discussed earlier, and as Neha has sort of already mentioned, the methodological framework, it's a flexible tool and it can be used in a number of different ways. And right now, I'm going to share an example of one way that it's been used so far. And then we'd love to have a discussion where we hear from you about different ways that you could use the tool in the context of your own work. So we'll go to the next slide, please. Thank you. And so how we used it, FemJust supported MenEngage Alliance to develop scorecards to assess national policies from 8 countries. And this is part of the larger policy analysis and impact assessment that we had done for the 10 countries. We focused down on 8 countries and developed scorecards for them. And these policies, they focused on gender equality, on gender-based violence, and on sexual and reproductive health and rights. And they included, all of them were inclusive of some sort of strategy to engage men and boys. And some of you on the call, and I know for certain some of you, were involved in this process. So you'll know what I'm sort of referring to. So in developing the scorecards, drawing on the methodological framework, we selected 20 indicators that were suitable for our project based on, and I mean, there were several, as you have seen, that was shared yesterday, there's several indicators. And for our purposes, it wasn't necessary, nor was it feasible to try to measure progress against and measure scores against every single one of the indicators. And so we selected 20 that were suitable for our particular purposes. Considering our location, we weren't in country when we were doing this. And I mean, this happened over COVID, which is still ongoing, as well as we selected 20 because of the methods and the reach. And we developed for each of these 20 indicators, we developed a qualitative scoring criteria. So data that was collected was done through a document review. It was done through interviews, as well as an online survey in order just to sort of, further expand the reach of the of input that fed into the scorecards. And we used these 3 data sources. We triangulated these 3 data in order to determine the scores for in each of the 20 individual indicators. And then we, just added up the scores across all the indicators and arrived at the percentage, which is the overall score for the policy. So it could be 5%, it could be, there was none that was 5%, but it could be, 50%, 60%, 80%. Interestingly, we didn't see any 80% scores, but we'll go on, we'll move on to the next slide. Thank you very much. And I'm sorry that you're not able, it's quite, I'm not sure what's happened. It doesn't look like it's very legible, so I will read it out for you, and I apologize for that in advance. So one of the example that I'll sort of hone in on right now is the indicator was the extent to which feminist and women's rights activists and organizations were engaged in the process of drafting the policy. So this is one indicator that we looked at for each of the policy scorecard grades that we were attempting to arrive at during the assessment process. So starting at the very top, which is a 5, a policy would score a 5 which is the highest score, if a broad range of feminist stakeholders were engaged, and they were engaged from a very early stage and had actual decision-making influence with respect to the policy content. So that's a 5. The score further reduces if feminist stakeholders, down to a 4, if feminist stakeholders were included, and were able to influence the policy, but there were challenges. This could have been in terms of diversity of the organizations. And this speaks actually to a point that was made earlier by a colleague about who's coming to the table. So there's that. And then also if there was challenges with respect to, for example, the conditions of providing feedback. So was a policy available publicly on a website or brought to town halls for a public review and a public feedback period? Or was there sufficient time allocated for that? Or was it, was there no publicizing of the fact that there's a consultation period, and or turnaround time for feedback by CSOs was a day, 2 days, 3 days. So that reduces the scores. And then sort of moving further down, a policy would receive a score of 3 if feminist and women's rights activists were involved to some extent, but perhaps they were brought in at a later stage. Their input might have been integrated and incorporated, but again, if they weren't brought in at the very beginning or during a very early stage, that further reduces the score. And then we move down to a 2, which is if the process engaged feminist and women's rights activists, but their input was not incorporated and not incorporated meaningfully. And finally, a score of 1 was sort of achieved if feminist stakeholders were not at all involved in the policy drafting process. Thank you. So we'll move on to the next slide. Thank you very much. So this is an example that MenEngage has developed, a sort of a visual of the scorecards. And this is the example of Costa Rica, which was one of the countries that we focused on. And just to note that Costa Rica is, we looked at their current national policy on the prevention of violence against women. And Costa Rica's policy is actually one of the very best, if not the best policy that we looked at. And so in looking at this, what you can see is along sort of, as you move sort of clockwise, it identifies the main buckets of work that we were looking at. So the 4 main areas of inquiry. So 1 was development, which the indicator I just discussed comes in at that stage. So it's development followed by content. If we continue going clockwise, content followed by implementation, and rounding us off with monitoring and evaluation. The subcategories, so each of the little categories that fall under one of these main 4 areas that were used to assess are diverse. And so maybe I won't go through each one, but I know it's a bit small. So I'll pick the example of implementation. So under implementation, we are looking at whether there was collaboration for implementation by feminist women's rights and queer activists and organizations. We're also looking at whether there was a sufficient budget for implementation. Whether there were sufficient human resources for implementation, whether there were clear work plans that delineated responsibility, where responsibility sits, and who's holding that responsibility, budget, personnel, a roadmap for actually implementing the work that was clear. And finally, whether the policy was actually implemented. So those are the subcategories under the broader area of inquiry under implementation. So we see here that with this example of Costa Rica, which has a very transformative, it scores very high on the right-hand side of this scorecard under development and particular development and content. And this is, something that we've seen and something that Jenny touched upon, which is development and content tends to fare well, but that under monitoring and evaluation and implementation is where things start to really drop off. And so the overall score for Costa Rica scorecard was actually 64% on a 100% scale. And so this is one example of how we use the methodological framework to support MenEngage in developing this set of scorecards. And we think it can be used by colleagues in countries to advocate for improved implementation, improved monitoring and evaluation. And it can be used by colleagues in other countries to advocate for their governments to follow better processes and to take better action, improved action. So again, this is but one example of how the methodological framework could be used in your own work. And so based on that, we'll skip over to the next slide. which is, yeah, we are at a Q&A right now, and I'd love to pose this question to folks. What are some of the ways that you think you might be able to use this methodological framework? And yeah, I'd like to just to open that up for discussion. So please feel free to raise your hand, or include it in the chat box. And thank you, Neha, for including that in the chat box. I didn't see any of that. Yeah, so are there any thoughts about some of the ways in which you might be able to use the framework? Might it aid you in collaboration with other, with feminist, with queer, with masculinity, youth groups to analyze a policy process? Could you use it to develop an analytical report for advocacy, for workshops? What are the ways that you think you could use it in your country? And really, the hope is that we can sort of learn from one another and gain ideas from one another.
Another thing we would love to hear is, are there any opportunities coming up at the country or the regional level that you think, you may want to sort of like work towards, whether it's something connected to the SDGs or the Gender Equality Coalition work. So yeah, we'd love to also hear about that if you have something in mind.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Hi, this is Tilina from Sri Lanka.
Hi, Tilina.
So actually, currently there's a debate whether sort of, how sexual harassment in the workplace or violence against women, especially experienced by female politicians in Sri Lanka, what kind of, policy framework is there, or are there too many policies, or whether policies have been implemented? So today I was a part of a discussion where some groups are trying to look at the prevalence of policies on sexual harassment in the workplace within the media institutions. I mean, this discussion is also quite helpful in that sense, because media institutions won't be readily willing to share these kind of policies. So then in that kind of sense, how do we engage is also a challenge. And then if there are any national level policies, for example, I think a year ago or so, there was a gender policy launched, especially in relation to how gender sensitive the media is in Sri Lanka. So that's something that I would like to hear from all of you also, how we can go about it.
Thank you for those examples, Felina. And it makes the point that it can be used, it can be adapted not only for state, national policies, but also policies within the media. And if I understood you, if I followed you correctly there, how it raises the questions like, about if there are multiple or there's a proliferation of policies, how many of those take into account, an assessment of the previous policy that was in place. So it raises that. Are there anybody else have any thoughts on what Felina said? Okay, so Jan has said that I would use it as a guide, but be careful about the actual scoring. For example, in certain contexts, women, particularly if not supported and of strong families, cannot easily afford to be vocal as feminists or women's rights activists in policy development, implementation, and M&E, because they know their place in the patriarchal hierarchy and their families and the risks they run. Yep. Yeah. We certainly have to be mindful of context and safety of human rights defenders. Yeah. And then Yoni goes on to say, another way to use the tool is to offer support to policymakers on the how. Yeah. So if you want a successful, impactful policy for the communities you serve, then this is what evidence shows works and does not work. So it's not only a tool for monitoring, but also for policy making. I think that's a fantastic point, Yoni. And you know, something that we discovered when we were doing this policy assessment is that, you know, and it's not brand new, but that oftentimes that the folks that are writing the gender equality policies or the SRR policies or GBV policies don't have significant experience working in these areas. And so, you know, not only does that sort of, yet again, raise the importance of it being a participatory process, but it opens up another avenue for, you know, this is potentially a way that we could support you in developing a really responsive policy to the needs of our communities.
Linda, could I just add
Please,
to,
yeah.
to respond to Yoni's point? You know, one of the dimensions of the flexibility of the tool is, yes, as advocates, as activists, as movements, we can use this tool to do monitoring and advocacy. But like Yoni says, the same tool, the same criteria, the same set of questions in the hands of a policymaker, or like, you know, even like a UN agency developing a strategy or a program, or a large sort of international NGO, like any actor really concerned with gender justice, concerned with working with men and boys, you know, can use like these questions can sort of also serve as a guide. This tool can serve as a guide for things they should be asking themselves, for things that they should be considering when doing the policy design, when you know, developing the content of a policy, when embarking on implementation, planning for monitoring and evaluation, etc. So yeah, just wanted to second Yoni's point with sort of those examples. Thanks, Linda.
Thank you very much, Neha. Anybody else have anything to say on that? Or thoughts you'd like to share? Okay. So Charles notes that for him, he might explore organizing a Boston area group of men who would show up in support of feminist and LGBTQ plus advocacy. The application is quite obvious there, and it's an essential aspect of what we would seek to do. Great. Suleiman notes that the tool is flexible enough to be contextually applied in quite a participatory manner. Mm-hmm. Oh, I think, and also said that so Sankey Gender Justice is at the inception phase of developing a baseline plan that includes an analysis of the policy environment. One of the challenges that I've had personally was the limitation of many policy scans that is often only documentary. The tool also uses intersectional elements that affect the success of the policy. Yeah. Thank you very much for sharing that, Suleiman. Luxman shares that while we look at using this as a tool to work with others, one key element would be that this becomes a tool that we as activists, organizations, and networks apply in the way we plan, implement, and are involved in any policy advocacy. In addition, this can be a tool to inform our own organizing and mobilization and how we show up in feminist spaces and our own politics around the work. Meaning orientation and strengthening of our own members' capacity within MenEngage. Any thoughts on that from partners in the room?
Maybe while people are thinking and typing, we can move to Jenny's comments. Also, just a gentle reminder that folks can raise their hands and make oral interventions.
Yeah. So and Catherine has asked if we can share the link for the tools, and I would ask my colleagues to please share. I think it was shared at the very top of the hour, but you might not have gotten it if you weren't in the room already. And we'll be sharing it at the end. So Jenny says, maybe it's good to unpack how we can adjust to the ever-evolving advocacy landscape, as policy scorecards analysis can often become quickly outdated as policies evolve. However, carrying out a rigorous process such as this yields rich learnings on the contextual policy landscape, which can be adjusted to further policy analysis. An example is the Turkey case study scorecard, and how the results of the national policy scorecard surface critical issues which contextualize the subsequent regressive decision to pull out of the Istanbul Convention. That's an excellent point, Jenny. It's an adaptive tool that you can adapt to changing circumstances. And at the time that we had developed the Turkey tool, which is one of the countries that we looked at as part of the 8, Turkey had not decided to pull out of the Istanbul Convention at that point. And so naturally now, if the scorecard was, if the framework was applied to a study of Turkey, the score would be different. So it's something that, can continuously evolve. It can be done annually if that's the process you want to do, if you want to use it as a scorecard. Thelina co-signs with Laxman. This would be something that MenEngage Alliance in Sri Lanka can also do, and that it's timely. I'm happy to hear that. Yoni also agrees with Laxman, and that this tool is equally applicable to our own actions to assess where we are applying intersectional feminist practice, for example, and how we develop our own strategic and annual plans. Yeah. I'm so happy to see that, the use goes beyond just external things, but also internally how feminist process can be followed. Trisha also agreeing with Laxman and echoing that in the Caribbean region is actually working on a current project that will use this tool to develop their own regional advocacy strategic plan. Oh, that's wonderful to hear. If you wanted to drop in more details or share more details, that'd be really great to hear, given that you're actually using it right now. But no pressure. Yeah. What other thoughts about the ways in which we have a couple of minutes left, in which you might use the methodological framework?
And apologies, I'm abusing my power as a speaker to to make a plea to Trisha, not to put you on the spot, but if you feel comfortable doing so, if you'd sort of use your mic to tell us more about this project, we'd love to hear a little bit more, sort of like the detail, the thinking, the aims of it. We're very interested.
Thanks so much, Neha and Linda. Sorry, I cannot turn on my camera. I'm on medical leave right now, but I'm happy to share briefly. This process is still unfolding for us, and it's part of Generation Equality Forum and the work of the Alliance, the Global Alliance, and how we at Kariman could contribute to this important work around advocacy. We somewhat, and I have some colleagues on the call who's also working on this with me as well. We're going to be looking at 10 countries. This is just our plan as of now, 10 countries, all of the countries that Kariman operates in. We're including, it's actually 8 countries, but we're including 2 more. And we're going to be doing policy scans across GBV and SRHR, and using the tool, the same framework that we're discussing here right now, to then figure out how could we see where does Kariman fits in this agenda with policy advocacy as well, and who at civil society, what civil society is doing on the ground, but also at the state level. It's going to be done through critical analysis and mapping, the same way you would have done as well, using the same the same methodology with interviews. We're going one step further to do a survey, to do a mass survey as well. And then out of that, we would use the findings to create a regional strategic, a 3-year plan for the regional advocacy working group at Kariman, with the hopes of continuing to deepen relationships and tapping into networks where we have not yet tapped into, with these 2 broad thematic areas, keeping in mind, making it intersectional and keeping on the principles of feminist-informed, but also looking at the socio-ecological model as well. So that's how we have envisioned it right now. But we saw the importance of using the tool to collect the data in order for us to present the findings of how to inform our next steps, our actionable items. And I think it's really important, specifically for the region, and very much so across the globe as well. But for our region, I feel like oftentimes we create projects and programs without looking from a broader lens. How could we have impact and meaningful impact with sustainability? And I think this is one good method that we're using, and we're happy to be here and also to be learning from both of you and to be able to adapt the tool as well as much as we can. Yeah. Just lastly, quickly to say that you all use 20 indicators, noting that you had this took you a year and a half to do. There's no way we can do this over a year and a half because of the duration of the current project that is streamlining this project for us, the bigger project. So we are going to narrow down this just to show you how we are able to scale the project to our use. You all use 20 indicators. We're going to probably, I think we narrowed down to 6 indicators that would allow us to get a holistic approach, intersectional approach as well. But we cannot use that 20 indicators for this particular project, but we're going to be using 6 indicators, and it's going to be spanned across 2 thematic areas across 10 countries. Yeah.
That's amazing to hear, Trisha. Thank you so much for sharing. And yes, like certainly, folks should you only take on what makes sense for their particular task, for their particular project. So if it means reducing it down to 6 or 5 indicators that are particularly well suited for your project, that's another way that the tool can be used, in terms of policy assessment. So thank you so much for sharing that example. It's really exciting to hear how it's being used in Trinidad and in the Caribbean region. So thank you again, Trisha.
Linda, could I just amplify something that Trisha said, and want to add my excitement as well. Trisha noted like deepening relationships, right, through a process like this. It's an opportunity to collaborate with other partners within the movement, and to deepen those relationships, right? Like through that collaboration, through the conversations of like what are the priorities, through the analytical process and coming to agreement on the analysis and then and also like the advocacy priorities. That's such an important point. Really, the analysis sort of is a piece that actually is enabling you to do so many other things. That's really really interesting to hear. And I think just wanted to add that like it's an opportunity to also, or like another sort of like tool that can be used in conjunction is to do a stakeholder mapping, right? Like when you're undertaking an analytical process like this, whether it's analyzing the policy framework, in conjunction with that, you may like, you may also find yourself like mapping the stakeholders, whether it's in the country or in the region, of who's doing what in terms of programming, in terms of policy advocacy. Who are the key actors to collaborate with or involve, consult, listen to, who are the key actors to influence. So just wanted to make that quick observation. Thanks.
Thank you, Neha. Okay, are there any final thoughts on this particular question? And Tricia is just acknowledging what Neha has said, and said that the tool will be used for policy mapping at the state level, but also civil society level. So any last thoughts on this, on ways that the framework might be used, that anybody would like to share? Okay. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for your kind attention and your participation. It's very much appreciated. And we really hope that you're able to use this tool in a way that supports your own efforts. And with that, I'm going to pass it back to Jenny for the final 13 minutes of this session. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Linda and Neha. I think I can speak for everyone by just expressing our deepest appreciation, for the session, for your unpacking of the methodological framework, for your collaboration alongside MenEngage Alliance over the last 2 years, actually, and your support in helping us to continue to nuance our policy advocacy. Through accountable advocacy, which really, as I've mentioned to both of you prior, I think we will continue to unpack the work that we did together over many years. And as you can hear from the session today, just really excited to see how we can continue to utilize these tools and analysis moving forward, and what an opportune time it comes at, in this complex world that we find ourselves in, of course. And so how can we continue to be standing in solidarity and being meaningful advocates and activists towards our end goal of the realization of the rights of all women, girls, LGBTQIA plus individuals, and carrying out informed and accountable and nuanced policy advocacy. So super appreciative. Many, many thanks, sincerely. And wonderful, just seeing here if there's any comments. Just many thanks, of course, from the group as well, echoing those words. And just maybe, if I may, I wanted to add one point in terms of the methodological framework and its links to the case study and policy scorecards. Just to reiterate one point, which is the framework, which is what we honed in on today and unpacked. But really to also share that within the case studies and scorecards, what was also so rich is, again, that contextual analysis, so how this process of carrying out the methodological framework analysis fits into a historical understanding, right, of feminist and LGBTQIA plus movements and activists within the context, also an analysis of social, political, and economic contexts. And so to not divorce, the methodological analysis from the broader context and how rich that really was. So also just to note that, and we're really excited to share those materials with you very soon. And I think to create more spaces for learning and capacity strengthening. Once we do that on the broader findings of the case studies and scorecards. So please look out for those spaces to be convened soon, so we can all continue to learn and raise capacities as activists and advocates. Thank you so much. Maybe if you can continue to the next slide. Wonderful. Then I guess we begin the wrapping up of the session. If nobody else has anything to add, if you do, please, as we're wrapping up, do share in the chat box. But at this point, then we begin to just share on the ongoing programming. We're fast approaching the conclusion of the symposium, but for a few more weeks, we continue to have sessions on Tuesday, which is our main plenary. Wednesdays are our regional sessions, and Thursdays, parallel sessions. And of course, you can register for upcoming sessions through menengage.org/symposium. And just to pause, and kindly invite you to our closing event, which will be happening as soon, on June 22nd on Tuesday. And you can register there. During this time, we'll be wrapping up a long journey that we've been on over the last 7 months with more than 100 plus sessions, of unpacking and dialoguing and critical reflection, which will culminate in the closing session on June 22nd. And there too, we will be presenting the Ubuntu Declaration and Call to Action as the political articulation of our way forward. So really looking forward to having you all there. Yeah, just the symposium app, drawing attention to that as well, where you can access many resources, video recordings if you've missed any of the sessions, some spaces for dialogue and chatting, and the discussion boards, and that is translated across languages. And I believe that's it. Maybe last slide is our wrap up. It's a warm thank you. Again, our deepest gratitude to Linda and Neha for just the rich collaboration that we've carried out over the last few years, for your participation in the session today. Also, a really rich thank you to all of you for your engagement in this dialogue, for sharing your experiences. I learned a lot. I think I speak for others as well, just how important it is as advocates to share on the wide and varied context of policymaking processes across the world. So thank you so much. Thank you to the translators as well, and to the MenEngage team for tech support and support on many levels. So we'll leave it at that. Thank you sincerely, and have a wonderful rest of your day.